The bell had rung hours ago, and the hallways of Westbridge High were silent now, except for the occasional creak of the old building settling into the night. Most students had fled to their homes, parents' cars honking in the parking lot and teachers packing up their desks. But for the small group of students left behind for after-school detention, the night was just beginning. It was a Tuesday when Ms. Aldridge arrived. Nobody recognized her. She was a substitute teacher, assigned last minute to cover for Mrs. Bennet, who had taken an unexpected leave. Ms. Aldridge was tall and thin, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to see too much, and a voice so calm it made the air itself feel colder. At first, everything seemed normal. She handed out worksheets, explained lessons, and walked the halls with a quiet authority. But strange things started to happen that same afternoon. First, the desks in the classroom began to shift overnight. When the students returned the next day, the seats were arranged in a tight circle facing the old chalkboard, though no one remembered moving them. On the board was a single phrase, written in neat but unfamiliar handwriting, "Remember what you forgot." Whispers spread through the school. Some students claimed to see shadowy figures lurking just beyond the windows, their shapes shifting in impossible ways. Others said they heard the creaking of floorboards and low murmurs in empty classrooms when no one else was around. Jamie, a quiet boy with a knack for noticing details, became suspicious. He noticed the strange drawings Miss Aldridge made in her notebook, sketches of faces with hollow eyes and twisted mouths, symbols that looked like ancient runes, and cryptic notes scribbled in a language Jamie didn't recognize. One day, Jamie found an old yearbook in the library, dusty and forgotten. As he flipped through the pages, his breath caught in his throat. There, staring back at him from a faded black and white photo, was a woman who looked exactly like Miss Aldridge. But the yearbook was from 30 years ago. Jamie's fingers trembled as he traced the face of the woman in the yearbook. It was unmistakably Miss Aldridge, but the photo was old, decades old. His mind raced with questions. Was it a coincidence? A relative? Or something far darker? That evening, unable to shake the feeling, Jamie returned to the classroom after hours. The hallways were cold and silent, shadows stretching like skeletal fingers beneath flickering lights. He crept inside, heart pounding, flashlight in hand. The desks were arranged in that same unnerving circle. The chalkboard held new writing, scrawled in the same neat but unfamiliar script. The past never leaves. It waits. Jamie's breath caught when he noticed the drawings on the walls, symbols carved faintly into the woodwork, scratches that hadn't been there before. Suddenly, a whisper echoed softly through the room. "You shouldn't be here." Jamie spun around, but the room was empty. Then he heard it again, a slow, deliberate tapping from the ceiling, like fingernails scraping wood. His flashlight flickered, and in the brief darkness, a shadow darted across the far wall. He gasped, stepping back. The door slammed shut behind him. He was trapped. And something was coming. Jamie's breath caught in his throat as he pounded on the locked door, his flashlight beam shaking wildly across the room. The tapping from the ceiling grew louder, closer, like something crawling just above the plaster. "Miss Aldridge," he called, voice trembling. "Let me out." Only silence answered. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered back to life, illuminating the circle of desks. In the center lay a small, ancient-looking book bound in cracked black leather, which Jamie was sure wasn't there before. His hands shook as he reached for it, the whispers rising in volume, swirling like a cold wind around him. Opening the book, Jamie found pages filled with symbols matching those scratched on the walls. Some were indecipherable, but others looked like names of students who had vanished over the last 30 years. And at the very end, a chilling note written in the same handwriting as the chalkboard messages. "She never left. The substitute teaches forever." A sudden coldness gripped Jamie's chest. The tapping stopped. The room plunged into silence. Then, from the corner, a figure stepped forward, tall, thin, with piercing gray eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. "Welcome to class, Jamie, the voice whispered. You're just in time to learn the final lesson. Jamie's heart pounded as the figure moved closer, Ms. Aldrich, but something was wrong. Her eyes glowed unnaturally, and her smile twisted into something cold and cruel. You don't understand, she said softly, voice like ice. I'm not here to teach lessons you want to learn. I'm here to teach those you can't forget. Jamie backed away, tripping over a desk. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. I've been waiting for someone new, she whispered, someone to carry on what I started, to join the permanent class. Desperately, Jamie grabbed the ancient book and threw it at her. It hit her chest, but she didn't flinch. Instead, the symbols on the pages flared with an unholy light, and a shadowy force erupted from the book, wrapping around Jamie like cold chains. He screamed, struggling as the darkness pulled him toward the circle of desks. Don't fight, Ms. Aldrich said softly. You belong here now. Just as the shadow engulfed him, Jamie's mind flashed with memories, not his own, but of countless lost students, their faces twisted in terror, trapped in the substitute's eternal lesson. But then, a spark of defiance. Jamie shouted a name from the book, a student who had once broken free. The chains loosened. With a final, furious effort, Jamie broke through the darkness, stumbling out of the classroom just as the door burst open. Outside, the school was silent again. The desks were back in normal rows, the chalkboard wiped clean. But Jamie knew the truth. Ms. Aldrich was still here. Waiting. The substitute who teaches forever. And next time, the lesson might be you. The wind howled outside, a cold gust that rattled the old windows of the school. Inside, the halls were eerily silent. It was late in the evening, and most of the staff had gone home. Only a few stragglers remained, finishing up their work under the dim glow of overhead lights. One teacher, Miss Henderson, had stayed longer than usual. She always stayed late, long after the students had left for the day. She didn't mind the quiet. But tonight, something felt different. The first sign was small, a creak in the hallway. At first, Miss Henderson thought it was just the old building settling, but then there was another noise, a whisper, soft and distant. It came from the empty classroom down the hall. Just the wind, she muttered to herself. But the whispering grew louder, as if calling her name. She stood up from her desk, her heart pounding, and glanced out the door. No one was there. Yet the sensation of being watched lingered, heavy and unsettling. She told herself it was just her imagination, but something kept tugging at her. As she walked toward the hallway, the temperature seemed to drop. The air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The further she walked, the darker it seemed to get. Her footsteps echoed through the empty halls, the only sound in the stillness. At the end of the corridor was room 204. It had always been a little off, a place where the lights flickered sometimes and the temperature never quite felt right. The rumors about the room were well known among the staff. People said Ms. Carlyle, the former teacher who had once taught there, had never left. They said she had died in the middle of a lesson, her voice echoing in the classroom long after her body was gone. Ms. Henderson reached the door, and as she touched the handle, the air turned ice-cold. She hesitated, but curiosity pushed her forward. She opened the door slowly, the sound of the hinges screeching in protest. Inside, the room was dark, save for the faint glow of the streetlights creeping through the blinds. The desk was neatly arranged, the chalkboard spotless. But then, Miss Henderson saw it. A shadow, just a flicker at first, standing at the far end of the room. Her breath caught in her throat. It was the figure of a woman, tall and thin, draped in an old-fashioned dress. Her back was to Miss Henderson, but the way she stood, it was unnatural. Almost as if she were floating just an inch above the ground. The whispering began again, louder now, clearer. Leave. Leave this place. Ms. Henderson tried to step back, but her feet felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the floor. The figure slowly turned around, and Ms. Henderson's stomach dropped. The woman's face was pale, her eyes empty black sockets, as though someone had scraped out all the life from her. A cold breath brushed against her ear. You shouldn't be here, leave before it's too late. Ms. Henderson's heart raced. She was frozen, unable to move. The ghostly figure raised a bony finger, pointing directly at her. The air around her thickened, the whispers growing into a deafening scream for her to leave. With a burst of adrenaline, Ms. Henderson sprinted down the hallway, the temperature rising in waves behind her. She didn't stop until she reached the exit and rushed out into the night air, gasping for breath. The next morning, Ms. Henderson returned to the school, but room 204 was locked. When she asked the janitor about it, he gave her a strange look. That room's been locked for years, he said, his voice low. No one's been able to get in since Ms. Carlyle. The chill of the night still lingered in Ms. Henderson's bones as she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Something told her that the ghost of Ms. Carlyle hadn't gone anywhere. She was still here, waiting. The school corridor was empty, save for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. It was long past the final bell, and the janitors had already begun their nightly rounds, pushing squeaky carts and dragging wet mops across the cold tiled floor. Most students had fled hours ago, but Jamie lingered, drawn by a strange compulsion he couldn't explain. He had always been curious about the old wing of the school, the part with the peeling paint, broken windows, and that single rusted locker at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't just any locker. Rumors had swirled for years that room 304 didn't exist, and that the locker next to it held secrets no one dared to uncover. Jamie's heart pounded as he approached the locker. Its metal surface was chipped and dented, covered in layers of faded graffiti that told stories of past students long forgotten. The lock was old and corroded, hanging loosely from a broken latch. He hesitated, then slowly lifted the door. A cold breeze escaped from inside, carrying with it a faint whisper that brushed against Jamie's ear like a ghostly breath. "Jamie," it hissed. He froze. The whispers weren't just noises. They were voices, soft and urgent, repeating his name over and over. He tried to step back, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. The locker door creaked open wider, revealing a darkness so deep it seemed to swallow the faint light around him. "Don't be afraid," the whisper promised. Against every instinct, Jamie peered inside. What he saw was not metal shelves or forgotten textbooks, but an endless void, blackness that pulsed with a terrible hunger. Suddenly, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang, and the corridor plunged into silence. Jamie's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts as he stared at the now closed locker. His fingers tingled, like they had been touched by icy fingers. The corridor was still, but the whispers hadn't stopped. They'd only grown louder, now rising in a chorus of fragmented voices, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry. He pressed his ear against the locker's cold metal. The voices were clearer now. "Help us. Let us out. Don't leave." Jamie's heart raced. Who were they? What were they trapped inside this ancient metal box? And why call his name? He spun around, half expecting someone to be watching him from the shadows, but he was alone. Just an empty hallway stretching off into darkness at both ends. The janitor's distant footsteps echoed faintly, but no one was close enough to hear the locker's whispers. He needed answers. The next day, Jamie returned with a plan. Armed with a screwdriver and a flashlight, he headed straight for the whispering locker before classes even started. The hallway was deserted. Morning light filtered weakly through grimy windows, casting long shadows. The locker sat there, dull and silent, almost taunting him. Jamie knelt and began prying at the rusted lock. As the lock finally gave way with a reluctant snap, the whispers rushed out like a flood. "Please. Trapped. Don't look." Jamie shone his flashlight inside. There was no bottom, no back, just a black hole stretching beyond reason. The air around the locker was unnaturally cold, and the light from his flashlight seemed to vanish the deeper it penetrated. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, then went out. In the total darkness, the whispers turned into desperate screams. Jamie scrambled backward, tripping over his own feet, heart hammering. When he looked again, the locker was just a locker, old, empty, silent. No whispers. No darkness. But Jamie knew the truth. The locker wasn't just metal and paint, it was a prison. And whatever was inside wanted out. For days after that morning, Jamie couldn't stop thinking about the locker. At school, his friends teased him, calling him "locker boy," but no one believed the whispers, or the cold darkness that had stared back at him. But Jamie knew it was real. That night, as he lay in bed, he heard it again, faint at first, barely more than a breath against the silence. Then clearer. "Jamie, come back." He shivered, pulling the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The next day, he tried to tell his history teacher about it, hoping for some rational explanation. But the teacher just smiled sadly and said, "Old buildings have their ghosts, Jamie. Best to leave them be." But Jamie couldn't. The whispering locker was calling him. He went back to the hallway, alone this time, well after school had emptied out. The corridor was colder than ever. His breath fogged the air as he moved closer to the locker. The whispers were like a siren's song now, luring, haunting, impossible to resist. Suddenly, from behind the locker, Jamie saw a faint outline, a shadow, flickering like a flame in the darkness. It whispered his name again, more urgently. Before he could react, a cold hand shot out from the gap beneath the locker door and grabbed his wrist. Ice crawled through his veins, freezing his blood. "Let me out," the voice hissed, 1,000 voices layered into one, desperate and pleading. Jamie tried to pull free, but the grip was iron-tight. His vision blurred. The corridor stretched and warped. Suddenly, he was no longer in the school hallway but standing inside a dark room filled with endless rows of lockers, all whispering and moaning. Faces appeared in the metal doors, trapped students, their eyes hollow, mouths silent but screaming in terror. Jamie realized with horror that these were the lost souls of students who'd vanished without a trace over the years, prisoners of the whispering locker. If he didn't escape, he would join them forever. Jamie's heart pounded as cold dread seeped into every fiber of his being. The endless rows of lockers stretched beyond sight, each one humming with a low, mournful whisper that filled the suffocating darkness. He tried to pull his arm free from the icy grip, but it was no use. The hand holding him felt like it was part of the shadows themselves, unyielding and cold as death. The faces in the lockers stared at him with empty, pleading eyes. Their lips moved soundlessly, mouths opening in silent screams. "Help us," one voice finally whispered from the darkness, the sound barely more than a breath. Jamie's throat tightened. Who are you?" he managed to gasp. "We are the forgotten," a chorus of voices echoed. Trapped between worlds, bound by the whispering locker, doomed to wait. The air around Jamie grew heavier, thick with despair and cold like a tomb. Suddenly, the locker door behind him creaked open. A dim, sickly light spilled out, illuminating the grotesque truth. Inside, he saw twisted, broken shapes. Shadowy figures, half-formed, flickering like dying flames. They reached out with clawed hands, grasping at the edges of the locker frame, desperate to escape. Jamie realized the locker was a portal, a prison created by something ancient and malevolent, feeding on the souls of students lost to its dark hunger. Panic surged through him. "How do I get out?" he begged. The whispers turned to a cruel laugh. "You don't leave. You belong here now." Suddenly, icy chains wrapped around Jamie's wrists and ankles. The world tilted, darkness pressing in like a crushing weight. But then, a faint glimmer of hope, a whisper, different from the others, soft and warm. Remember who you are, Jamie. Fight. Summoning every ounce of courage, Jamie struggled against the chains, focusing on the warmth in the whisper. With a roar, he broke free, stumbling back through the swirling shadows. The locker slammed shut behind him. He collapsed on the cold tiled floor of the school hallway, gasping for air. The whispers were gone. For now. Jamie lay on the cold floor, his chest heaving, sweat and tears mingling as the fluorescent lights above flickered erratically. The oppressive darkness from the locker was gone, but the cold grip of dread remained, curling like smoke around his heart. He forced himself to his feet and looked down the empty corridor. Silence. No whispers. No shadows. Just the faint hum of the school settling into night. But as he turned away, he caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye, a flicker of movement near the locker. He stepped closer, heart pounding again. The door was slightly ajar. And inside, the darkness pulsed once more. Jamie reached out, trembling, and touched the cold metal. The whispers returned, soft, seductive, impossible to resist. Jamie. His fingers brushed the edge of the locker door, and suddenly his vision blurred. He was standing again among the endless rows of lockers, faces pressed against metal doors, eyes pleading silently for freedom. A cold voice whispered into his ear, "You cannot escape. You belong with us now." Panic surged, but then he remembered the warmth, the hope, the voice that urged him to fight. Summoning his last strength, Jamie slammed the locker door shut with all his might. The darkness recoiled like a wounded beast, and the corridor snapped back into place. Jamie stumbled out of the old wing, the whispering locker silent once again. But as he reached the main hallway, he saw it. A new locker, freshly painted, numbered 304, right where the whispering locker used to be. And beneath it, a small, faded name tag. Jamie. The school had claimed him. And somewhere deep inside, the whispering locker waited, patient, hungry, eternal.